Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Parkel and I'm so happy you're with me today. You know, stories are our single most powerful learning tool, as is evidenced by how our ancestors used stories to navigate and survive the savannah and evolve into the brilliant beings we are today. But lots of training and coaching doesn't stick because the educator wanders in the wilderness of logic and reason, and all meaning in the learning is lost. That's why I'm excited to bring you learning guru Celisa Steele, who will show you how to use storytelling to maximize learning engagement in continuing education and professional development that helps organizations in the business of lifelong learning improve your reach, revenue, and impact. Why do we humans tend to overcomplicate everything? I was hosting a Business of Story Mastery course for a company in the education space in our conference room back at our old ad agency called Park & Co. I had 8 eager participants learning the ABT narrative framework. As you know, the ABT is a 3-word story structure of and, but, and therefore that uses the 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, and consequence that speak directly to our primal pattern-seeking, problem-solving, decision-making, buying limbic brain. But as I was doing the training, I noticed one lady who was in charge of their website get angrier and angrier. She sunk into sullenness by slumping her shoulders, folded her arms across her chest, and began mean-mugging me. I stopped my training and asked her, "What? What's the matter?" She leered up from under her furrowed brow and said, "I think the ABT is reductive and insulting." "Reductive and insulting?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, "it's too simple, it's stupid." "Please explain," I coaxed. She said that things simply couldn't be explained in, well, such a simple way, that we had to get complicated sometimes. So I mentioned Albert Einstein, who said, "The definition of genius is taking the complex and making it simple," to which she responded with a big harumph and just simply turned away. This tale brings me to a book my good friend Bob DeMeo, who is the chairman and co-founder of Fiducian Advisors in Chicago, recommended to me last week. It's called Same as Ever, a guide to what never changes, and it's written by Morgan Housel. Now, you might recognize Morgan's name from his New York Times best-selling book, The Psychology of Money. His recent book, Same as Ever, is a collection of 23 short stories highlighting timeless human flaws and patterns to help you make better financial and life decisions based on the things that never change, instead of trying to predict the future. In it, Housel writes, quote, "Let's discuss an enduring quirk of human behavior, the allure of complexity, intellectual stimulation, and discounting things that are simple but very effective, in preference to things that are complex but less effective," end quote. He goes on to say that in most situations, a handful of simple variables drives the majority of outcomes. If you've covered the few things that matter, you're all set. A lot of what gets added after that is unnecessary filler that is either intellectually seductive, wastes your time, or is designed to confuse or impress you. Now, I'm afraid this young professional who declared the ABT as reductive and insulting was simply making the mistake so many of us make of creating complexity to look and sound smart, when just the opposite is where our genius shines, making the complex simple. Information bombards us every single day. There is far too much competition for our limited attention. Complexity simply adds to confusion. But there's hope. Even if your first instinct is that the ABT is reductive and insulting, try it. See how it helps you craft clear, compelling, and most importantly, concise messages. You can try it at businessofstory.com/ABT. Now I'll leave you with this from Einstein, who also said, quote, "It can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible, without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience," end quote, which he simplified to, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler." Are you making things more complex than they have to be? Let your genius out of the bottle by using the ABT to clarify your story, amplify your impact, and simplify your life. Because, as you'll hear from today's guest, every story you tell is actually a little teaching module. And learning is about creating meaning for your audiences quickly and clearly.
So as much as possible, if you can help when they're ready to learn, right? They have experienced something that's making them think, I need to do this. That's when they're going to be sort of most open to learning. It's a little hard to kind of figure out how best to meet people in that moment. But, even simple things like making sure you have a very clear outline for your course, for example, so that if someone knows that you can kind of help them broadly with this topic, but you know what, right now they just need this one specific bit of information. If you can sort of get them to that quickly, that's going to help with them engaging. So, it really is about that need and the meaning that they're seeing in it for themselves.
Celisa Steele is the co-founder and managing director of Tagoras. Tagoras partners with professional and trade associations, continuing education units, training firms, and other learning businesses to help them to understand market realities and potential, to connect better with existing customers and find new ones, and to make smart investment decisions around product development and portfolio management. She also co-founded Leading Learning, an offshoot of Tagoras, which provides resources to learning businesses, including the weekly Leading Learning podcast, free webinars, and the Learning Business Summit, an annual online conference. In fact, Celisa hosted me on their Leading Learning podcast on how to use the ABT to make your online and in-person courses irresistible to your students. It's episode 396 on their show, if you're interested. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Celisa Steele. Celisa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Park. I am thrilled to be here.
We got a chance to meet, was it back, I guess in November, early December, Annapolis, Maryland. We were both out at PAR, the Professional for Association Revenue's annual conference, and had a chance to talk there. And you and I got acquainted over the first meal that night, and it was so wonderful to meet you and the work that you do in helping people like me and very large organizations train people through engagement and how to put your best teaching foot forward to get people to engage and create that impact that we are all about. So how did you find yourself getting into this line of work?
Well, it was a very clear-cut path. I majored in graduate school in comparative literature, so this was the natural next step after that. Not at all, but the connection is that I really was interested in learning all along. I'm one of those people who enjoyed being a student, all along through elementary, even junior high, maybe a little less so in junior high, high school, college. I really loved learning. I thought I was going to be a college professor, but ended up, after I got my master's in comparative literature, the job market was just really tough for teaching professionals. Folks weren't getting jobs, and if they were at universities you'd never heard of, in states you'd never heard of, kind of thing. So sort of stepped back and ended up getting involved with online learning early on, and And then just sort of over the course of years was working with a company that developed online learning, sort of a kind of an early precursor to what Coursera and Udemy are doing now in terms of really trying to democratize access to great teachers and great content. And then after that company sort of slowly imploded in the dot-com boom, my partner Jeff Cobb and I started a company, and in that company we actually built online courses. We ended up building a learning management system. We ended up selling that, and then we founded another company together called Tagoras, and that's our current company. But the through line in all of that is just a real true interest in learning and trying to learn myself and help others learn.
And so give us a little bit of a backdrop on Tagoras. What is it you all exactly do?
So we do a range of things, but it really all focuses around helping folks with the reach, revenue, and impact of their learning offerings. So they might have online courses, they might have conferences, they might have in-person seminars, anything that's really focused on learning. And the group that we work with, it's all about marketing and selling those learning experiences. So it's not corporate L&D with that captive internal audience, and it's not degree granting higher ed. It really is organizations that are building and offering content, or individuals who are building and offering content to help others in their career and to advance professionally. And so that's our focus there, and we do it through consulting projects with organizations. We also try to make sure that we're providing resources even for folks who might never be consulting clients. So we have the Leading Learning podcast, we have webinars, we offer other events to really just try to support as many people as we can.
Yeah, so your learning consultation is around folks like me, I guess, I do both in-person training, virtual trainings, and I have also online courses. So I would be like a typical type of client of yours to say, okay, I've got this great content out there, but it's not maybe quite engaging like I want it to, or maybe I'm brand new to it. And I say, how do I put this stuff together, Celisa, so that it's actually going to make an impact that I'm looking for?
That's right. And so, we're agnostic in terms of the subject matter. I mean, we assume that the organizations and individuals coming to us for assistance, you're the expert in what you know. And so what we can add to that then is that learning lens of how can we really help you make sure that the message is landing and is engaging those learners and is having an impact in their lives.
All right, so let's start with what is one of the biggest problems you see out there, the mistakes that we make when trying to share our content?
I think one of them has to do with putting the focus too much on the content. I mean, the content is a core piece of it, but we can't neglect that why, the what's in it for me from that learner perspective, because in order for them to want to engage with that content, they have to understand, how it's going to be meaningful and relevant to their lives. So that's one aspect of not focusing too much on the content. I think the other part of it is that as experts, sometimes we go too deep in the content. And so we really want to share everything we know about whatever our, most passionate topics are. But really, we might better serve the learners by pruning back and really taking it down to the essential, and not overwhelming them, because as experts, we know a lot more than those beginners, and it can overwhelm them. You can create cognitive overload that actually then inhibits the learning if you're not thinking about, okay, what is the essential here? Let's get rid of everything that's not essential.
So it's so important to make sure that you outline what's in it for them. And I suppose that people get so enamored with their own content that they kind of naturally say, well, they're going to get it. They're going to obviously see why this is important to them. So let's just dive right into it because it's so good. And what I'm hearing you say, Celisa, is that no, first, spell it out. Share with them the story of what a brighter tomorrow is going to be if they learn what you are about to teach them.
That's right. And it can be within the context of the learning experience. So like if you have that online course like you do, Park, you might build in some of that time for the what's in it for me and not just sort of jump straight to your content. The other part of it is that it can also feed into your marketing, right? So even as you're preparing the learners to potentially engage in your course, up front, you're making that case about why this matters to them. And obviously that's going to help with conversion, right? If people don't understand the value to them, they're not likely to sign up in the first place. But if you do get them, there, you do still want to make sure that they understand the importance to them. And you can point to some things, but ultimately it really is going to be about the learner making the connection herself. I mean, we can sort of point to what we think's in it for you, but ultimately that learner has to go, this is the pain that's keeping me up at night, and this course is going to help me address that. And so there is a little bit of, we can sort of lead learners to water, but we can't make them drink. So we got to set up the right parameters, but they do have to engage. They do have to think. They do have to make those connections.
I actually have a pun that I use that plays off of that, and it says you can lead leaders to knowledge, but you can't make them think.
Yeah.
So it's the same idea, right? And then it plays into that curse of the expert that you talked about. And I've fallen into that too. I have, studied so much around storytelling and all this that when I was first training, I would lose my audiences because I would just dive so deep. And then I realized that, in the business world, most of these people really don't want to be story theorists. They just don't care. They do want to know how to use these frameworks like the ABT to be able to have much more impact in their messaging in life. And so I learned that the hard way. How do you know when you maybe have produced a course and it's out there and you are suffering as from the curse of the expert? How do you know that it's not resonating because you've dumped too much on them?
Well, I think this is at that point you're listening to your audience, right? And you're looking at what data you're getting from the engagement. So if you start to see that, okay, you're getting a lot of people to sign up, but you're not getting a lot of people to complete, for example, that might lead you to think, okay, maybe I've sort of gone too far, and maybe they don't need as much detail as I've gone into. Hopefully you've been engaging with the audience even before you've put it out there, so that you can hopefully avoid putting in that too much there. But if you're having those sorts of issues where people maybe aren't completing, that can be a sign that maybe you've gone a little deeper than you need to, and so then that could lead you to revisions to make it much more effective and engaging.
Mm-hmm. Something else I've seen in this idea of the curse of the expert is the expert trying to give too much value. We think like, we know all this stuff. They need to know all this stuff. They're paying me to be able to deliver this. I need to take them as deep as possible. So when they leave here, they feel like they really got a big bang for the buck. But it's kind of the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, sometimes it's the less is more, right? That we hear about. But because the value of learning so often comes from our ability to retain and then apply that information or that skill or that knowledge, that is where less is more. Because if it's just 3 simple steps, if it's just ABT, for example, that's fairly easy to retain, which makes it much more likely that people will apply it and actually make use of it. So there is a real benefit to really pruning down to the essential.
All right. So on this idea of kind of less is more sometimes, again, how do you know when you're making that mistake? Is it purely around engagement and people just aren't getting through? Or do you even listen to your audience and have them share with you what's going on?
Yeah, I think that you want to use all available data. So again, it depends a little bit on how you're teaching, right? In an online course, you'll have different data available to you than if you're delivering a keynote, right? That's going to give you kind of in the room feedback. You're going to be able to maybe read body language if you're delivering a speech, but you really want to kind of pay attention to it. Now, of course, all of that's like really more about course correcting. So up front, it's really around, if you can, avoid needing to potentially course correct in the moment. And so you want to do your research up front. You want to be really clear on essentially learning objectives. And there's a lot of argument in the field around the role of learning objectives. I don't believe that they need to necessarily be shared with a learner, but I think as a developer of content, you should be really clear on what your objectives are for a particular learning product or service. And if you really get clear on what those objectives are, what you want to do is map all of your content back to that objective or those objectives and say, is this actually serving the purpose? And if it's not, if it's sort of a nice to have, get it out. Doesn't necessarily have to totally go away, but maybe it gets put into sort of some extra resources that learners can access, but it's not sort of embedded right there in the middle of your course and kind of distracting learners from really that core content. So being really clear about your objective is going to help you make sure that you really are focusing on what's important, and just be really ruthless about that's all that you really include in at least the main flow of your learning content.
Yeah, so we coaches and teachers out there typically find ourselves in 3 different venues, and that is, of course, that asynchronous training, like mine is on Thinkific, so they can come and take it whenever they want. Or I do virtual training, a lot of that, online. Don't get to be in the room with people, but you've got now a live session going. And then you've got the in-person live training mastery courses that happens too. Do you approach those 3 different channels or deliveries systems differently with your training, or does the overall architecture of your content remain about the same?
I'd say the overall architecture remains constant, because really this all has to do with the human brain. And the human brain is the same whether we're interacting with the content, in person, or synchronously online, or asynchronously online. So just sort of those limitations of our working memory and not being able to process too much at once, those concepts of cognitive overload, that's going to apply in all of those situations. Now, the tools that you have to sort of help you in any of those specific situations may vary a little bit. So you're going to want to be aware of those tools and the options that you have, but the overarching approach would be the same.
Yeah. Is there a time frame for engagement? And what I mean by that is, if you're training, you want to be able to give X amount of information or coaching, and then you want to kick into activities, whether it's online or, in my ABTs of Agile Communications course, there's activities that they can do asynchronous, that's a hard word, asynchronously, you know what I'm trying to say.
On their own time.
On their own time, thank you. In the virtual sessions, I try to block out a certain amount of intro training and then get them engaged immediately. And then you saw how I did it, in person at the PAR event. So is there like the perfect amount relative time to teach and then to get them, active in it, actively workshopping it?
I think in terms of a specific guideline, I would go back to Brain Rules and John Medina, and just sort of think around 10 minutes. The human brain tends to kind of need something to help it re-engage. So you want to think about that being sort of our natural pause for a need to do something. So it might be kind of 10 minutes of presentation, and then you want to transition into, a turn to the person beside you at your table, or, pause the online course and make notes about X. I think that can be a good rule. The other thing is, it doesn't necessarily have to be that drastic. Even just sort of giving a true beat, a true pause, and then moving on to a new topic can help. But you really just want to kind of avoid that it just all seeming of a piece for a very long time, because that just makes it easy for the brain to tune out.
Now, I haven't heard of that book, Brain Rules. That's
Yes,
what's cost by John Medina. What can you tell us a little bit about that as a resource?
Well, it's a great resource from kind of just summarizing a lot of the science about learning and how the brain engages in learning. And it gives you some of those takeaways, like that one around kind of 10-minute rules, or not really a rule, but it's sort of a 10-minute guideline around, thinking about your content in those 10-minute chunks, because that's going to match sort of the typical human brain attention span. He has other sort of takeaways in there. It's a relatively old book. I'm not sure exactly, maybe 20 years old, something like that. But it's a really good, just fairly slender volume, but with a lot of good summary of the science and then the implications for that science.
So when you were in a training and you're watching someone else do it, what are some of the cringe moments that you see people do that could be very quickly fixed?
I think we all have different reactions, like something that might cause me to cringe, you might love, Park. Like, let's take the example of, turn to that partner at your table and talk about X. I am a introvert at heart. And sometimes those sort of open-ended, turn to your partner, talk about X, feel a little overwhelming to me. And I don't know, Park, but maybe that's something you love because you just love to meet people and you are so psyched when someone gives you that opportunity. So I think what you want to do is, as much as possible, build in options. Options do help with engagement because it gives that learner the sense of agency, the sense of choice, especially adult learners. We really like to feel like we are choosing what we're doing. We don't like to feel like we're being forced. Maybe that applies to kids too, but I know that the research has been mostly done around kind of adult learners and that sense of agency. And so giving options. And so it could be even as simple as, either turn to the person beside you or make a list, on your note paper about X, Y, and Z. So you're giving them sort of choices about what to do. I think the other thing is just being aware of accessibility as much as possible. And I do mean that very broadly. So, yes, it would include people with disabilities. So, if you say something like stand up, if you like doing X, and there are people in the room who can't stand up, you're excluding them, whether or not you mean to. So that's, one example. So again, options, raise your hand or stand up or stand if you're able, just being aware of sort of the language and how you are encouraging people to engage and participate. And for me, a lot of this goes back to their kind of three key ingredients to engagement, which are safety, meaning, and availability. And so you want to make sure that you are creating places and experiences where people feel safe, where they have what they need to be able to engage. That's the availability, and that there's meaning. That's sort of the what's in it for me that we were talking about earlier, and that needing to allow time for learners to see the value of what you're teaching them.
So you've got these three rules of engagement. Safety. Let's talk about that just a little bit more. Does that ultimately mean that, when you are learning, you do often find yourself in a vulnerable situation because you don't want to look and sound dumb and whatever, even though you're in there learning something that you don't know something about? And so is that about just creating a safe place that they're in the room and they feel like that they can open up and be a true participant in what you're teaching?
Yes, I mean, you nailed it there. The point is that without safety, we really can't engage, right? So if I'm worried about admitting that I don't know the answer, or if I'm worried about answering a question because I'm afraid I will seem ignorant, that's really going to cut into my engagement and cut into my learning. So you want to create that safe space where people do feel like they can share and they can be their full selves and not have to kind of hide and be like, oh, pretend that they know the answers. So safety is really kind of like the baseline. That's one of those elements we have to have for engagement, but without it, you essentially kind of can't do anything beyond that. So that's really important to have it there. And a lot of it is around psychological safety. I mean, arguably in schools in the US this day, physical safety is also a concern, but in most cases you're thinking more about that psychological safety.
And what are some things we can do to ensure that we are offering that psychological safety?
Yeah, I think as much as possible, even just saying up front, we're not expecting you to have the answers. We value participation over correctness. I mean, some of those just sort of ground rules and just the environment in which you create at the outset can really help people to feel safe or not safe. We were talking a little bit about, accessibility or inclusivity. So just being aware of the language that you're using too. Are you, I don't know, using male pronouns in all of your examples, or what are you doing to potentially kind of involve people and make them feel like, oh, this is for me. I'm part of it. So a lot of it does have to do with language in terms of how you create that psychological safety.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen is people, the really brilliant ones that are teaching out there, sometimes and they don't mean to. It's an inadvertent thing, but they end up sort of talking down to their audience.
Mhm.
They're trying to lift them up by talking down to them, and I found that really doesn't provide any sort of safety
Mhm.
whatsoever. That we have to come from below the audience and help elevate them up. And so,
Mhm.
like when we are doing our work, I'll get an ABT in and we'll, workshop it live on stage. But I will always begin with, you did a great job and thank you for having the courage to share this. And you've got the form down. This is awesome. Let's see if we can refine it to see if we can even make it a little bit stronger. And I
Right.
have found that works way better than, kind of that inadvertent talking down to them. Okay, great job. Let's fix it. That just doesn't work.
Right. When even before you praise what they've done and try to correct it, I mean, you've gone to the step of just asking their permission up front. I mean, sometimes you'll see people who just be like, okay, we're going to use this as an example. And maybe they haven't even done that step of asking for permission, which you could see how that would really potentially make someone feel unsafe, right? They sort of think they've shared something with you and then it's being, up there on a screen in a conference room. So, you know, even small things like that we don't necessarily stop to think about or maybe we take for granted, but that's part of creating that safety.
Yeah, really is. So, in your 3 keys of engagement, safety, next up is meaning. What do you mean about meaning, and how do you create it?
Yeah, so meaning really is does the participant see some value in engaging in that experience? So that's the what's in it for me, that's the relevance, that's the applicability to their daily life, to their work. And so that meaning has to be there because you can have a most beautifully created course, but if it's on, I don't know, tiger taming and I don't have access to a tiger, then it's just the meaning's missing in that case. I'm not going to be wanting to engage with that content.
So, it's really what you had started out talking about early on is you've got to create meaning right up top for them of what's in it for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And that related to that they need to see that relevance, and then they also need to believe that sort of the effort that's going to go into engaging in that learning experience is going to be worth it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
might be relevant, but also is it kind of is the return on investment in terms of their time and energy worth it? Because maybe it's a 20-hour course and really they just need something much shorter. So again, there's the sense of relevance and that sense of kind of a matching the return on investment of time and energy.
What do you think about this trend of micro training that's so popular? And by that, I mean, for instance, I've got in my ABT course, I've got 3 roughly 20-minute videos. Some are shorter. In under an hour, you can take the 3 modules. And I've had several trainers now tell me, Park, you should really break that up into 23-minute videos in this whole micro training concept. I'm just curious your take on that.
I think it comes back to that learning objective that we touched on a little bit, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. And it may be that for what you're trying to do, breaking them apart doesn't work, right? Because you want to teach about the ABT framework. And if you just teach about and without the but and the therefore, it doesn't really give the learner enough. There's, back to that sort of meaning, there's not enough meaning there. So I think that micro learning can be incredibly powerful, but you do need to be really clear on what your objective is and can you deliver on that objective in 20 minutes. If you can, wonderful, then do it. But be sort of don't be beholden to a seat time or a run time. Think more about what is it you're trying to do, and maybe that can be done in less time, and maybe it can't. Maybe you do need the longer time to cover the content.
Mm-hmm. What about our audiences? Are people just typically, and I know this is going to be a broad generalization, but are people just generally lazy and don't really want to learn this stuff? In my experience, you've got 1/3 of if that, it might be 20% to 1/3 that are all in. They're just like, tell me everything. I want to absorb all of this. Then you probably got about another 40 percent that are on the fence, like win me over, maybe I'll do this, maybe I won't do it. And then you do have about 25 to 30% that just don't care and aren't going to do anything. Is that true across the board? And is there any way to shrink that last percentage of people and get them at least on the fence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that it is a mixed bag, and you have sort of just the well, like I said early on, I mean, I loved being a student, so you're gonna have those people, right? And you can kind of put me down in front of any kind of course, and I'm gonna be sort of intrigued for the most part, and want to engage and go through it. And then yeah, you're gonna have others who are much more rigid, and if it doesn't immediately strike them as something absolutely valuable, they're not necessarily going to engage. So, I mean, I think that that meaning part of engagement that we were talking about can help with the getting people on board and getting them off the fence. If they really see that this can apply to their work and to their life, that's going to make them much more likely to engage. And so, I think the other thing that we can do, and this is a little bit of it can be hard to actually execute on, but we don't want to focus necessarily on the container, right? Like most learners want just in time information, just in time support for what they're trying to get done. I mean, that's when there's that point of need and people want something that's going to help them. So, as much as possible, if you can help when they're ready to learn, right? They have experienced something that's making them think, I need to do this. That's when they're going to be sort of most open to learning. It's a little hard to kind of figure out how best to meet people in that moment. But even simple things like making sure you have a very clear outline for your course, for example, so that if someone knows that you can kind of help them broadly with this topic, but you know what, right now they just need this one specific bit of information. If you can sort of get them to that quickly, that's going to help with them engaging. So, it really is about that need and the meaning that they're seeing in it for themselves.
I always have been a big believer that education training, and I got a chance to teach at ASU for 5 years as an adjunct professor in a master's program teaching sustainability in the School of, or teaching storytelling in the School of Sustainability. And I learned a lot because I'd never taught before, and they had some terrific course, curriculum designers that came in and said, okay, Park, this is great, but you might want to think about this. So they taught me a lot in that process. One thing that I've seen to me that really resonates is when that teacher or coach is a storyteller, certainly, and it's as much performance art as it is to get them, entertain them, to get them educated. So that, in my work, I, of course, pull a lot of examples out of pop culture and examples that they know and see where they can see these frameworks actually at work on them and they didn't even know it, and show them how to do it. But I found that you've got to be a bit of a performer this day and age and have fun. And so the question to you is, where does storytelling and humor and that sort of thing that sometimes gets pushed off by, upper level academia as being too woo-woo or BS, but where does that entertainment come into play in training in your world?
Well, there's another way to look at engagement that involves three views. And so we have cognitive engagement, we have emotional engagement, and we have behavioral engagement. So it's about thinking, feeling, and doing. And I think that the emotion that can often come from storytelling, that stories can be very good at helping to get that emotional engagement. And so I think that that's one place where stories can do a lot. And I think that stories too, back to the meaning, safety, and availability, you can also use stories, to kind of help drive home each of those aspects of any particular, piece of content that you're offering. So you can use that a story, for example, around, we were sort of talking about psychological safety. So one of the stories that you tell is a little bit self-deprecating. Maybe that's going to help people feel better about, their perceived lack of knowledge around the topic coming into this. Or, the story can be about meaning, how someone else engaged in this experience and the results that they had because of engaging in that learning experience. So I think stories do play a huge role in engagement, for sure.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt, one of America's foremost social psychologists. I see you nodding there. You obviously know of him and his work and
Yeah.
so forth. He said a line that I really lean into all the time. A long time ago, when I had him on my show several years ago, we talked about it too. And he said, our minds are story processors, not logic processors. And
Mm-hmm.
so in training and teaching and coaching, of course, logic and reason comes into all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I have found that it's just much more powerful to deliver it via a story to demonstrate or show the impact of the point that you're trying to make, that the brain just seems to open up more to that idea when you deliver it in a story that it can picture, it can see, and actually it can kind of participate in, that leads to the moral of the story or that aha moment of like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. And what we're doing is we're replacing opinion and assertion coming from us as the experts, but we are actually showing our point in action.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, we were talking too about that kind of 10-minute guideline that John Medina and Brain Rules talks about. And as I was saying, it doesn't necessarily have to be as sharp a shift as, it's going to be from kind of a talking head to a hands-on activity. It could be like you're talking about, could be kind of, there's a little bit of a piece that's on sort of the logic and the kind of hard data behind a point, and then you shift into a story, and that's going to definitely help with that brain then kind of re-engaging after that time of being a little bit more logical. So there are a lot of ways I think to use stories in teaching that, and as we know, that's just, I mean, I think stories have been teaching mechanisms for as long as they've been around. So yeah, there's a strong connection.
Yeah, well, storytelling, I argue, is probably the very first technology we used as cavemen and cave women to navigate and survive the savannah. Before we had anything else, we had stories, and stories are the ultimate learning tool, right? You use that. I saw it in action one time. Some of my listeners who are here a lot will recognize this story. But about a year ago, I was doing an online virtual training with a large veterinarian association in America, and I was working with their sales and marketing team. And they had one young lady on there. I'll call her Sarah. I'm guessing she was probably in her late 20s, judging by the Zoom interaction with her. And taught them, of course, about the and, but, therefore, and whatever. And in our second session, Celisa, it started, and Sarah raised her hand real quick, and I asked her, and she said to me, she goes, Park, I studied and graduated from journalism in school, and I have been writing copy here for the last 5 years, and I guess I can see how the ABT would be powerful, but I'm not going to use it because it feels too jilted to me, too stilted to me, is what she said. Therefore, I'm going to keep doing what I've always been doing. And so I started laughing, and she looked at me like, why is he laughing at this? And then I looked around that Zoom room and realized everyone else was kind of looking at me like, wow, what a rude dude. Why is he laughing at her? And then I realized she didn't even realize that she used an ABT to tell me why she's not ever going to use the ABT. And when I pointed that out to her, she started laughing. And I said, see, it's a natural thing. It's the way our brains make meaning using this thing. And it doesn't have to feel stilted to you just because you know it. You can make it your own. But I love that because it just demonstrates through story, through a moment that actually took place, at just how powerful this little framework is, that it is residing in our brain, whether we like it or not. It's how we make meaning out of the madness of being human beings. But I share that story often in my trainings when somebody raises their hand and asks, well, Park, this ABT thing seems a little reductive and insulting, or, oh, Park, it's just 3 words. It can't really work. And then I share that little story as a training tool, saying it does work, and we don't even realize it because it's working in the background. I don't know, have you ever had that kind of experience in training out there when someone isn't quite grasping what you're talking about, but are actually using it and they don't even realize it?
Oh, yeah, I think that does happen, quite often, and for me, one of the lovely things is that for me, it tends to be more through writing, but for some people, it's through talking that you actually kind of realize what you do or don't know. Now, your example of Sarah, she didn't kind of even hear it until you kind of quoted back to her what she had said. But I think, as people try to respond in the moment, you really get a good insight into where their thinking is and maybe where their gaps are and sort of understanding what's going on. So I think it's always great when you have a chance to get people to reflect. We're big fans of reflection questions. And if you're in a context where you can get people to respond, that gives you a ton of feedback about what's going on in their thinking, and which can really help you then with their learning. Yeah, it's always interesting to know where the disconnect is, because that can then help you refine what's going on. Trying to think of a specific example, and it's always a little bit challenging because I think there's so many to think about.
Yeah, well, in my training too, I try to use those reflection questions. I never thought of that title before, but if I can get my audience talking to me and sharing back, are they learning this? Is it connecting? Is it not? Or look for that face in the crowd that looks like really skeptical or really frustrated or whatever. I like to go to that person too and say, what's going on? How's this working for you? Something seems like something's missing. How can I clear that up for you?
Yeah, and I've had a couple of situations where you think someone actually is really skeptical because of that expression on their face. And then when you do ask them and say, you realize that they're actually having this whole moment of how this actually applies in the organization. So like the look is more of like intense thought rather than skepticism. It's sort of like, oh, I've been thinking about this wrong for a long time. And so they don't really kind of know what the visual of their face is giving. And so again, if you can kind of connect with them and hear what they're saying, that can give you a lot of more accurate information about kind of what's going on in their mind and how they are or aren't thinking about the content.
Right. So the last little part of our interview conversation here is, do you have like steps outlined when someone is thinking about putting together a course? It could be an online class, it could be an in-person speaking gig or whatever. Do you have any sort of course instruction outline that they should be thinking about from top to bottom?
Well, we always like to start with essentially market assessment, which also could be called, knowing your audience. And so making sure that you're really clear about what is needed in the market and what maybe already exists in the market. Because if you can feed that into your development process, that's going to just set you up for success much more readily than if you kind of go in blind and don't really understand what else is out there and what are the resources your potential learners might already have access to. So we always like to start with making sure that there really is kind of an awareness of what else is out there in the market. And then just being really clear about that learning objective so that then what is that essential content that you can prune it down to. And then once you're really looking at the content, we do have a range of resources that we like to draw on. We have a little self-paced online course called Presenting for Impact that we make available for free to help folks who end up leading sessions. And so it takes some of that research from things like brain rules. It takes information from Made to Stick, which is another sort of summary of learning science.
The Heath brothers.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
shoot, then I did the wrong title. Then I always confuse it. You're right, because the Heath brothers have a book that's a very similar title. This one is Peter C. Brown and Henry Roediger and one other gentleman who really kind of reduce learning science and take a lot of lessons learned. So we draw on all of that, and we have a little kind of roughly hour-long online course that folks can go through to really sort of think about, okay, with if you have a particular session in mind, what can you do? It gets into things like cognitive overload and how you can make sure that your visuals and any audio that's going along with the visuals don't fight for your learner's attention, for example, and things like that. So once you get into that content, there are a lot of specifics around kind of how to make it as effective as possible. And then, of course, once it's built, then there's all of the promotion and just that effort around, converting it and making sure that people are aware of the resources, getting into that meaning aspect of it and the what's in it for me, and making sure that you're communicating that well. So obviously, very high level, but that's sort of that market assessment, having that clear then objective that's based on that market assessment, then really pruning your content and making good use of what we know from learning science, and then making sure that you're conveying the message about your learning product or service out to the world. Those are kind of the 4 top level steps anyway.
That's great. In that Presenting for Impact free course, where can people find that?
They can find it at leadinglearning.com/PFI.
leadinglearning.com/PFI, Presenting for Impact.
Correct.
Perfect. Well, Celisa, thank you so much. You have been a wealth of knowledge. I've learned a ton just on my own training work here. So I really appreciate you taking the time and being here. And I also want to thank you for having me on your show a few weeks back. What show number was that? I have that written down here somewhere. If anyone wants to go listen to it, I'll put a link in the show note. I don't have it handy on me at the moment. I thought I did.
Well, wonderful. Thanks for having me on, Park. Yes, and it was wonderful to have you on the Leading Learning podcast. And I know I learned an awful lot from your session at PARS Rev Up and from having you on the podcast. So thank you for the work that you do and really just helping to simplify that storytelling process so that we can all make use of it.
Well, I appreciate that. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to report that this episode certainly wasn't reductive and insulting. Thanks for listening and sharing it with anyone you know who would benefit by becoming a more compelling teacher, coach, consultant, and, well, even a web designer. I've had the privilege this year to teaching hundreds of business leaders the ABT and our other story structures in our Business of Story Mastery course. People at Walmart Canada, LG Electronics, Ascensus, Ren Financial, Green Irony, Converter.io, the Better Business Bureau, and most recently, HubSpot, Franworth, and beloved brands. It's just been a pleasure teaching you all about the business of story. And of course, I'd love to help your people excel through the stories they tell. It's not complicated. I can deliver our proven courses through in-person or virtual training, which all start with our micro-training online course called The ABTs of Storytelling, which you can take right now at businessofstory.com/ABT. And here's the great part. You get to decide for yourself if the ABT is reductive and insulting or genuine genius. I've been getting a lot of compliments lately on our show music, for which I would like to thank our composer, Darius Holbert, who created all of it custom for us. I'd also like to say thank you to Caden Howell for editing our show and to Marissa Hill for marketing and community development. I hope you'll join us next Monday when storyteller extraordinaire Rain Bennett will join us to share how he helps small businesses with their storytelling. Until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it clear, make it concise, and make it marvelous. Thanks for listening.